2 weeks before the tragedy, Rob Reiner reached out to Billy Crystal with a request that would soon feel ominous in hindsight. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon, November 30th, 2025. Rob's voice over the phone was unusually direct. "Come over. I need to talk to you for a bit. It's not about movies." Billy arrived at Rob's Brentwood home shortly after 4 p.m., immediately sensing that something was off. Rob stood in front of him, looking exhausted, his usual composure replaced by weariness, his shirt slightly wrinkled, sleeves rolled higher than normal, and hair untamed. The handshake they exchanged felt weaker than ever, a subtle hint of the emotional toll Rob had been carrying in silence. Inside the living room, the house was uncharacteristically quiet. The television remained off, no music played. Habits Billy had grown used to during countless visits were absent. Rob poured water into a glass, yet did not drink. His gaze kept drifting toward the hallway leading deeper into the home, a small but unsettling detail. After several minutes of tense silence, Rob began to speak, his voice lower and hoarser than usual. "Things in my family are a mess right now. I haven't told anyone, but I'm truly exhausted." Billy asked for more, and Rob spoke openly about his son, Nick Reiner. At the beginning of November, Nick had relapsed, triggering marked changes in behavior. Irritability, sudden anger over trivial matters, and evenings so unstable that Michelle, Rob's wife, would leave the bedroom to avoid spiraling arguments. Rob recounted a specific confrontation just before Thanksgiving, an argument over finances and treatment in the kitchen. He admitted that the moment chilled him, a stark recognition that he could no longer predict his son's reactions. Throughout the conversation, Rob described his attempts to maintain Nick's presence within the family, believing it might help stabilize his son. Yet, underlying that effort was a haunting fear. "I'm just afraid that one day, if I push the boy away, I'll be the last person who makes him collapse," Rob confessed, almost speaking to himself. His fingers interlaced tightly, a gesture of restrained emotion, and Billy recognized the gravity of the situation. He leaned forward, reminding Rob that his own safety and Michelle's were at risk. "Family bonds are natural," he said, "but boundaries were essential." Rob listened, quietly absorbing the warning, acknowledging the danger while admitting his deep attachment to his son prevented him from seeing Nick as a threat. The meeting ended in heavy silence. Rob walked to the window, staring out at the backyard where so many family gatherings had occurred, then turned to pat Billy on the shoulder, promising to think everything over after Thanksgiving. Billy left with a lingering unease, a rare sensation after visiting Rob's home countless times. Something profoundly wrong was unfolding beneath the surface, a private tension Rob had carried alone for years. That afternoon would become one of Billy Crystal's most vivid memories, a haunting prelude to the horror that would strike the Reiner family just 14 days later. After the quiet Sunday meeting, Billy Crystal carried with him a sense of unease that would not dissipate. Rob's words, his exhaustion, the subtle details of the home, the drifting gaze, the untouched glass of water, the tense stillness, remained vivid in Billy's mind. Rob had confided deeply, exposing the turmoil within the Reiner household, the ongoing struggles with his son, Nick. Yet, even with this insight, Billy left that day believing, as so many do, that a father's love might be enough to contain the storm. He did not yet grasp the full scope of the danger, nor the silent chain of warning signs that had been accumulating for years. Rob had been carrying a burden few could imagine. For decades, he bore the weight of a complicated family dynamic in silence, protecting his wife and shielding the world from the volatility within his home. He described evenings when Nick's irritability escalated to fury, when minor disagreements spiraled uncontrollably. Michelle had learned to avoid confrontations, stepping out of the room to prevent escalation. Rob explained to Billy that he had hoped maintaining proximity and connection with Nick would help stabilize him, a father's instinct to safeguard his child even when the child's behavior was threatening. He feared that any misstep, any moment of perceived rejection, could push Nick past a breaking point. Billy listened carefully, recognizing the subtle indicators of danger Rob had observed for himself. He remembered Rob's words, slow and deliberate. "I'm just afraid that one day, if I push the boy away, I'll be the last person who makes him collapse." Rob's hands were tightly interlaced, a gesture of suppressed emotion, and his eyes betrayed the exhaustion of someone who had been fighting alone for years. Billy urged him to consider the risks to himself and Michelle, to set clear boundaries and protect their safety. Rob nodded, acknowledging the advice, but unable to reconcile it with his unwavering commitment to his son. In the days that followed, Billy remained haunted by that conversation. He thought about the signs he had observed and those Rob had recounted, the emotional outbursts, the volatility, the repeated relapses. Rob's previous efforts, including the production of Being Charlie, were meant as a lifeline to his son, a structured attempt to guide him back to stability. Yet the underlying issues, addiction and behavioral instability, remained unresolved. Billy could not shake the sense that the warning signs were converging toward a moment of crisis. Less than 2 weeks later, the Christmas party hosted by Conan O'Brien would become a critical flashpoint. According to attendees, Nick appeared agitated, behaving erratically, more so than usual. Conversations with friends revealed that the argument between Rob and Nick, occurring just hours before the tragedy, had been heated, stemming from ongoing tension regarding money, treatment, and personal accountability. This confrontation was, in many ways, the physical manifestation of the issues Rob had described to Billy in private, a volatile mix of fear, frustration, and uncontrolled emotion. Billy recalled the chilling detail that Nick was absent from the Brentwood home at the time the bodies were discovered. Rob had once confided that he could no longer predict Nick's reactions during moments of extreme tension, and Nick's absence became a piece of the puzzle, connecting past warnings to the unfolding reality. The Reiner home, normally filled with laughter, conversation, and activity, had been eerily silent. When friends and family arrived, the discovery was horrifying. Rob and Michelle were found separately, the aftermath indicating that the violence had escalated rapidly and unexpectedly. The pattern of prior incidents, the repeated relapses, the volatile arguments, and the private warnings Billy had offered all pointed to a slowly escalating crisis that no one had fully addressed. Billy reflected on his own role, the helplessness he felt despite knowing the severity of the situation. He had seen the signs, spoken up, and yet, even his decades-long friendship and trust with Rob could not prevent the tragedy. In the aftermath, as Nick was arrested more than 20 kilometers from the family home, Billy closely followed the legal developments, realizing that the full implications of Rob's confessions, the Christmas party altercation, and Nick's absence were converging into a stark reality. Billy would later describe his experience as both a witness and an outsider, watching as a tragedy he had foreseen in part unfolded in the most horrifying sequence imaginable. Every word Rob had spoken, every subtle cue, every warning sign became a haunting reminder that even the closest bonds, the deepest care, could not always prevent a collapse long in the making. When friends and relatives arrived, attempting to maintain the usual schedules and visits, the first indication of something amiss was the unresponsive front door. Repeated knocks went unanswered. The familiar flow of life inside the Brentwood house had come to a complete halt. Billy remembered Rob's earlier confession that sometimes the atmosphere inside the home became frighteningly quiet, almost ominous, during moments of high tension with Nick. On that day, the silence extended for hours, a haunting echo of the private conversations Billy had shared with Rob. The discovery of Rob and Michelle was a scene that would remain etched in Billy's memory. Rob was found first by Romy, who entered the home and immediately panicked upon seeing her father. Billy later reflected on the state of the home itself. Despite the violence, the house appeared largely undisturbed. Furniture remained in place. Personal belongings were intact, and the surrounding space bore no signs of forced entry or external interference. This indicated, in Billy's mind, that the tragedy had been entirely internal, rooted within the family dynamics rather than the intrusion of an outsider. It was a horrifying confirmation of what Rob had confided. The danger had been close, intimate, and painfully personal. Nick's absence at the time of discovery added a chilling layer to the unfolding narrative. He had left the house hours earlier, fleeing the immediate aftermath, and was later apprehended near the University of Southern California, over 20 kilometers away. Billy also reflected on the psychological impact of witnessing the immediate aftermath. The scale of panic and shock experienced by Romy, the absence of Michelle at the initial discovery, and the quiet disarray of a home that had been meticulously maintained all contributed to a sense of profound unease. This was a house that had never experienced prolonged silence, a home built on routines, laughter, and shared life, now transformed into a site of sudden and overwhelming tragedy. In private conversations afterward, Billy described his realization that the sequence of events mirrored Rob's earlier warnings. Nick's behavior had followed a familiar, escalating trajectory. The incident was not abrupt in the broader context of family history. It was the culmination of repeated crises, relapses, and unresolved conflicts that Rob had struggled to manage in silence. Every subtle indicator Rob had shared, the tension in his hands, the drift of his eyes, the exhaustion in his voice, had been a precursor, now terrifyingly validated. Billy's grief was compounded by the awareness that he had seen much of this coming, yet had been powerless to intervene. His private warnings to Rob, his efforts to advise boundaries and caution, had not been enough. The tragedy unfolded despite decades of love, care, and intervention attempts. The enormity of the loss, both personally and in the context of their long friendship, left Billy feeling both witness and outsider, observing a collapse that had been nearly inevitable, yet still deeply shocking. The day's events confirmed what Billy had feared. The Reiner family tragedy was not a random act of violence, but the painful result of long-standing issues that had quietly accumulated. The home, once a symbol of familial warmth, had become a testament to how unresolved tensions, emotional suppression, and fragile mental states can coalesce into devastating consequences. For Billy, this day marked the transformation of private concern into public grief, and a chain of events that would forever alter the way he remembered his closest friend, Rob Reiner. In the days following the discovery of Rob and Michelle Reiner's deaths, the reality of the tragedy began to settle in, first with close friends and family, and then gradually with the public. For Billy Crystal, the impact was both immediate and profoundly personal. He was no longer just a friend. He was a witness to the culmination of decades of private warnings, of moments he had observed, and of confessions Rob had shared about his son, Nick. Each memory of the prior conversation, Rob's exhaustion, his trembling hands, the drift of his eyes, and the haunted tone in his voice, now gained a haunting clarity. Billy followed developments closely, learning that Nick Reiner had been apprehended later that evening, far from the Brentwood home, near the University of Southern California. Over 20 kilometers separated him from the scene, underscoring the chaos and panic that had enveloped him in the hours following the murders. The arrest confirmed the unsettling pattern Rob had described, moments of emotional instability escalating into uncontrollable actions. Nick's past relapses and prior behavioral crises, which had seemed troubling but manageable in isolation, had now aligned into a catastrophic sequence. Friends in the entertainment industry recounted that Billy withdrew almost entirely from public life. He avoided year-end gatherings, skipped usual visits to restaurants, and spent days confined within his home. On rare occasions, he would quietly drive to Brentwood, surveying the house and its surroundings from a distance. To outsiders, he appeared isolated. To those who knew him well, it was a manifestation of profound grief compounded by a sense of helplessness. He had known the warning signs, he had spoken up, and yet he had been unable to prevent the tragedy. The weight of that knowledge settled heavily on his shoulders. Billy described the emotional landscape he navigated during this period as one of duality, grief intertwined with guilt. He replayed every moment of his final conversation with Rob, recalling the exhaustion in Rob's eyes, the anxious tone when he spoke of Nick, and the subtle details of the home that now seemed portentous. The untouched glass of water, the silent living room, the drifting gaze down the hallway. Each detail had once seemed minor, but now took on the gravity of a prescient warning. He questioned whether more decisive action, more insistence, could have altered the outcome, yet the inexorable truth remained. The trajectory had been set long before that winter day. The legal developments added another layer to the grief. Nick faced 2 counts of first-degree murder with aggravating factors for multiple victims, along with a special allegation. Held without bail, he awaited trial in early 2026. Billy understood that the case was not merely about individual culpability. It revealed decades of unresolved family dynamics, cycles of relapse and behavioral instability, and the silent struggles Rob had borne to shield his family. The personal and the judicial intertwined, emphasizing that the tragedy was not an isolated event, but the outcome of a long, hidden sequence of emotional and psychological strain. Billy's reflections extended beyond the immediate facts. He thought of Rob's attempts to guide his son through filmmaking, particularly Being Charlie, a project intended to serve as both creative outlet and therapeutic endeavor. Rob had hoped the film might stabilize Nick, offering structure and connection. Yet the unresolved issues, the underlying instability, the tension between parental love and the necessity of boundaries, remained quietly unresolved. Witnessing Nick's arrest felt like observing the final collapse of the very faith Rob had invested decades in sustaining. Among friends, Billy expressed that his own grief was intertwined with self-reproach. He lamented not staying longer at Rob's home on that November afternoon, not arranging another meeting, not pressing more forcefully for safety measures. He repeated a phrase he had told himself privately. "I thought I still had plenty of time." But in the cruel aftermath, he realized that time had already run out. He bore witness to a series of events foretold, yet powerless to intervene. The public tribute that followed, jointly issued with his wife Janice Crystal and other longtime collaborators, became a means of giving voice to both personal grief and the enduring legacy of Rob and Michelle Reiner. Billy reflected on their decades-long friendship, their shared creative journeys, and the trust that had defined their professional and personal relationship. The statement served not only as a farewell, but as a testament to the human complexity behind the public personas: a loving father, a devoted husband, a meticulous filmmaker, and a friend who had fought tirelessly, quietly, and ultimately tragically to protect those he loved. Billy's pain, the unrelenting sense of helplessness, and the public mourning intertwined. He became a symbol of the intimate cost of this tragedy, a reminder that even the most devoted care, the most attentive friendship, and the clearest warnings could be insufficient in the face of cumulative, unseen familial pressures. The story of Rob and Michelle Reiner, as Billy Crystal saw it, was not only about loss, but also about the quiet, powerful forces of human vulnerability, of unspoken fears, and of the limits of love in preventing disaster. In the weeks following the murders, the legal process began to unfold, casting a harsh spotlight on the Reiner family tragedy. Nick Reiner, arrested more than 20 kilometers from the Brentwood home, faced 2 counts of first-degree murder with aggravating factors for multiple victims, alongside a special allegation. Held without bail, he awaited his next court hearing in early 2026. To Billy Crystal, the proceedings were not merely a matter of law. They were the formalization of a catastrophe he had long sensed but had been powerless to prevent. The weight of history, of private confessions and warning signs, now intersected with the rigid mechanics of justice. Billy observed, with mounting distress, that the legal narrative was only beginning to reveal the depth of internal family tensions. Investigators emphasized that the sequence of events within the 24 hours leading up to the discovery of Rob and Michelle's bodies needed careful examination. It was clear, from what Billy heard, that the tragedy was entirely internal, shaped by long-standing behavioral patterns, untreated crises, and cumulative stress within the Reiner household. The violence had not erupted from a single external trigger, but was the inevitable outcome of pressures that had gone unaddressed for decades. As news reports circulated, Billy felt a duality of emotion: grief for the friends he had lost, and a profound frustration at the realization that, despite decades of friendship, advice, and private warnings, the tragedy had not been averted. He reflected on Rob's lifelong efforts to protect his family, to guide his son, and to create a space where stability could exist even amid persistent volatility. Rob's endeavors, including the production of Being Charlie, were now cast in a tragic light, a final attempt to stabilize Nick that had ultimately failed to prevent catastrophe. Billy's grief was compounded by his own sense of helplessness. In private conversations, he confessed that he had replayed every interaction with Rob over the years, examining moments when he could have intervened more decisively. He remembered the exhaustion in Rob's eyes, the fear he had confided regarding Nick's unpredictability, and the small but meaningful signs: the untaken glass of water, the wandering gaze, the tense stillness of the Brentwood home. Each detail, now magnified by hindsight, reinforced the notion that Rob had been carrying a burden too heavy to bear alone. Friends close to Billy reported that he withdrew from his usual social life. He avoided restaurants and year-end gatherings, spending long periods inside his home. Occasionally, he would drive quietly to Brentwood, pausing to absorb the enormity of what had occurred. This solitude was not mere mourning. It was a processing of grief entwined with guilt and recognition of a sequence of warnings that had preceded the event. He acknowledged to those around him that he had seen the signs, and yet, despite speaking up, he had been powerless to alter the outcome. The public tribute Billy co-signed with his wife Janice and longtime collaborators, including Albert Brooks, Martin Short, Larry David, and others, became a crucial act of remembrance. In the statement, they emphasized Rob's mastery as a storyteller, his deep respect for actors and writers, and the rare ability to create collaboration over command. For Billy, the statement was more than a professional acknowledgement. It was a final act of friendship, a public expression of loyalty to the memory of Rob and Michelle, and a way to preserve the intimate truth of their lives together. The grief extended beyond professional circles. For those who had known the family personally, the realization that the tragedy had been long in the making created a complex web of emotions: sorrow, regret, and a painful understanding of the limitations of human intervention. Nick's absence at the scene of the crime was particularly haunting. Billy remembered Rob's earlier confession about not being able to predict his son's reactions under pressure. The alignment of past warnings with the events of that day created a profound sense of inevitability, amplifying the personal and public shock. Billy's reflections also encompassed the broader implications of the tragedy. He understood that this was not merely the story of two lives lost. It was a cautionary tale about the invisible pressures within families, the accumulation of untreated crises, and the ways in which love, care, and patience, even over decades, can be insufficient when compounded by mental instability and unaddressed behavioral issues. Every detail of the house, every sequence of prior conflicts, and every moment of unheeded warning contributed to a narrative that was as human as it was heartbreaking. Even as the legal proceedings moved forward, Billy's internal processing continued. He revisited the nearly 50-year friendship he shared with Rob, the trust, the laughter, the creative collaboration, and the shared understanding that had defined their lives. This reflection, while painful, also reinforced the depth of connection that had existed. It was this bond that motivated him to speak out, to ensure that the tragedy did not erase Rob and Michelle's legacy, and to illuminate the hidden dynamics that had preceded the unimaginable events of December 14, 2025. In the weeks that followed the murders of Rob and Michelle Reiner, the ripple effects of the tragedy extended far beyond the immediate family. For Billy Crystal, the experience was intensely personal, a confrontation with grief unlike anything he had previously faced. The nearly 50-year friendship he had shared with Rob encompassed professional collaboration, personal confidences, and deep mutual trust. Losing Rob was not just the loss of a friend or colleague. It was the loss of a constant presence, a guiding voice, and a witness to his own life. The grief was compounded by the manner in which Rob had died, tragically, violently, and at the hands of his own son, transforming sorrow into a complicated, almost unbearable burden. Billy retreated into a self-imposed isolation. He avoided public appearances, skipped familiar social gatherings, and spent hours reflecting quietly in his home. Friends observed him walking through rooms, staring out windows, and returning repeatedly in his mind to the final conversation he had shared with Rob. Every detail from that Sunday afternoon on November 30th, the exhaustion in Rob's eyes, his tense hands, the wandering gaze, replayed endlessly. Billy's grief was layered with a gnawing sense of helplessness. He had been warned, he had given counsel, and yet nothing could prevent the chain of events that had led to the tragic deaths. The news of Nick Reiner's arrest crystallized the narrative of inevitability. 2 counts of first-degree murder, aggravating factors for multiple victims, and a special allegation transformed the private family tragedy into a public legal spectacle. Billy, however, focused less on the courtroom and more on the patterns that had led to this moment. Decades of family tension, unresolved emotional crises, repeated behavioral relapses, and the unspoken pressures Rob had silently shouldered. Each element reinforced a painful realization that even the closest bonds, profound love, and careful guidance could not always prevent disaster. Billy's reflections naturally turned to the Reiner family dynamics. Rob had tried to stabilize Nick through presence, structure, and, ultimately, the production of Being Charlie, a film that was intended not only as a professional endeavor, but as a lifeline to his son. Rob's hope that this creative project would redirect Nick's life was tragically unfulfilled. As Billy watched the legal developments and observed Nick in custody, he understood that Rob's decades-long efforts to intervene had been insufficient against the cumulative weight of unresolved issues. Each relapse, each volatile argument, each moment of silence within the household had been a precursor, a subtle signal that now appeared almost prophetic in retrospect. The isolation Billy imposed on himself was not a retreat from responsibility, but a space for deep reflection. He grappled with guilt, not for Rob or Michelle, but for himself. He questioned whether he could have acted more decisively, whether he could have pressed Rob harder to establish boundaries or intervened more forcefully. He recalled his private thoughts after leaving Rob's home on November 30th, a single thought repeating in his mind. Something was profoundly wrong. He carried that awareness for weeks, haunted by the knowledge that his insight had come too late to prevent tragedy. Even within grief, Billy sought a way to honor Rob and Michelle's legacy. He collaborated with close friends and longtime associates to issue a public tribute through the Associated Press. The statement highlighted Rob's mastery of storytelling, his devotion to collaboration, his respect for actors and writers, and his enduring role as a creative and moral anchor in their lives. For Billy, this tribute was not only a professional acknowledgement. It was a moral imperative, a means to preserve the memory of his friend and to convey the depth of his life, both public and private. It was also a recognition of the intense personal sacrifices Rob had made in attempting to navigate the challenges of his family while maintaining his public career. Billy's grief was complicated by the duality of witness and outsider. He had seen the warning signs, spoken to Rob, offered counsel, and yet could not prevent the events that followed. This duality created a persistent ache, a reflection on the limits of human intervention and the fragility of even the closest relationships. He carried the weight of the private knowledge he possessed, the precise details of Nick's volatility, the patterns of family tension, and Rob's personal confessions. Each memory was a reminder of what had been lost and of what could never be restored. Ultimately, Part 6 of this story underscores the intersection of friendship, grief, and helplessness. Billy's reflections reveal the profound complexity of human relationships, the burden of foresight, and the enduring impact of loss. Through his private processing and public tributes, he attempted to reconcile the tragedy with the decades of connection, trust, and shared experience that had defined his life with Rob Reiner. The pain was both intimate and universal, a reminder that even in the face of love, care, and decades of devotion, some outcomes may remain beyond the reach of intervention. As the weeks turned into months, the Reiner tragedy settled into public consciousness. But for Billy Crystal, the impact remained intensely personal. The loss of Rob and Michelle was not only the loss of dear friends, but the abrupt severing of a lifetime of shared experiences, trust, and mutual understanding. Every memory, from long conversations about cinema to quiet afternoons discussing family and life, was now overlaid with the grief of absence. The weight of what had happened was amplified by the knowledge that warnings had been given, yet the tragedy had still occurred. Billy reflected on the enduring bond he shared with Rob, a friendship spanning nearly 50 years. From their first meeting on the set of All in the Family to decades of creative collaboration, their connection was built on trust, mutual respect, and a shared vision of storytelling. Rob had guided Billy through both personal and professional challenges, offering insight, encouragement, and a steady presence. Losing Rob was akin to losing a compass, someone whose guidance had shaped not only Billy's career, but also his perspective on life and art. The public tribute Billy co-signed with Janice Crystal and longtime collaborators, including Albert Brooks, Martin Short, and Larry David, became a symbolic gesture. It captured not just Rob's professional achievements, but his humanity, the care he extended to actors, writers, and colleagues, and the dedication with which he lived his life both publicly and privately. For Billy, speaking out was a final act of devotion, ensuring that Rob and Michelle's lives and their shared legacy would not be overshadowed by the tragedy. Billy also carried with him the heavy awareness of Nick's role in the events. His son's absence at the time of the discovery, the escalating behavioral issues, and the pattern of past crises now formed a narrative that was impossible to ignore. Billy understood that Rob's devotion, his protective instincts, and his attempts to guide Nick through love and patience had been monumental, yet insufficient against the cumulative pressures and unresolved conflicts. This realization reinforced the fragility of human efforts when confronted with persistent, complex personal and familial challenges. In private reflection, Billy wrestled with the notion of prevention and inevitability. Could more have been done? Could the warnings, the interventions, the efforts at dialogue and guidance have changed the outcome? These questions remained unanswerable, leaving a space filled with sorrow, regret, and an acute understanding of human limitations. Yet even amidst this grief, Billy found meaning in remembrance and acknowledgement. By sharing his memories and speaking publicly, he honored Rob and Michelle as individuals, as a couple, and as part of his own life story. Ultimately, the Reiner tragedy is a testament to the complexity of human relationships, the unseen tensions that can build over time, and the enduring impact of love, patience, and devotion. For Billy Crystal, it became both a deeply personal loss and a public reminder of the fragility of life and the necessity of confronting difficult realities, even when they are painful. Through grief, reflection, and public tribute, he sought to preserve the memory of Rob Reiner, not just as a filmmaker, but as a father, a husband, and a friend whose life, though tragically cut short, left an indelible mark on all who knew him. The legacy of Rob and Michelle, their love, and the warnings left unheeded, endure as a cautionary story, a reminder of the fragility of human connection and the profound importance of paying attention to the signals of distress within families. Billy Crystal's account ensures that their memory remains alive, intertwined with the lessons their lives and deaths imparted to those who witnessed both their triumphs and their final, heart-rending tragedy.